Okay, we've got our model created and we want to integrate it in with a FileMaker solution. Here I have a demonstration file for you. I'm going to open it up and give you a little bit of a tour as to what's going on here. First of all, you see that we're opening up to a layout that's called model. It doesn't currently have any records in it. This is a table that I've set up that will store this model and potentially other models in the future. So the decisions that you have to make, if we quickly look under the hood, are whether or not you want to create a separate table for your model or models, which is what I've decided to do here. Or if you already have an admin table or a global table that your system is already using, you could easily go ahead and add these fields into those existing tables and use that to load and access your model. So what's going to be required if you, whichever way you end up doing this, is you'll need a container field. You can call it whatever you want, but I called it model file. It's the FileMaker container fields that will store and allow you to run the models within your user sessions. So you'll make sure you have that file. The description isn't absolutely necessary, but if you have more than one model, it might be helpful for you to store descriptions. Model name is required, and parameter name is required. Parameters are really either kind of text or image. Here, what we're doing is we're doing a general model, which is a text model. So the parameter that I used when creating the model file was text. So we'll get to that in just a bit. I also think it's important for you to track the state of the model. So I've created a number field, which is called model is loaded, which would either have a 1 if the model is loaded or a 0 if it's not. I'll show you a couple of different ways that we're managing that value. So the other part that you should be aware of is how you're going to be able to access the model. So here inside the sentiment text table, that's going to be the table where I've got a field that actually has text in it that I want to analyze to see whether it's positive or negative. So I would need access from any record in the sentiment text table back to the model table. Now, for those of you that are familiar with global tables, which of course is just a table that has all of the fields set up for global storage, if you're going that route, then you don't need a relationship between this table, because any table context, any record in any table context in your entire solution will have access to a global table. So if you didn't do a global table, what I did here instead is I used the old Cartesian X, which is really the all records in the model table equal all records in the sentiment table. So this way I can access this model and analyze any record in the sentiment text table. So just a couple considerations there for you. So now you see that I have 0 records in this model table. I'm going to create a new record. I'm going to add a description in here. I'm going to add a parameter name, which I mentioned before, in this case is text. And then I'm going to take the model and I'm going to drag it into a container field. Pretty easy. And I'm going to add the last required value, which is sentiment. So I've got the sentiment classifier model stored in the container. I've given it a description and the name and the parameter name, and you see that it's not currently loaded. I also have this little layout object here, which is really just a button bar that shows the not loaded value when it's not loaded and shows the loaded value when it is loaded. Let's take a look at what the script is doing behind the scenes here. I'm going to click on this button to invoke the script, and there's a couple things here. You'll notice at the very top, I'm establishing the context of the model table. So depending on which methodology you're using, the global table or the Cartesian X, or maybe something more sophisticated, you're going to need to have access to the model. And the reason for that is because later in the script, you'll see down here, I'm using an if to say, is this model loaded? And I thought I would add this option in here because this is kind of interesting. In FileMaker, in FileMaker 19 and greater, you have this thing called get model attributes function. And the get model attributes function will give you back, as you can imagine, the attributes of your model. Very similar to get container attributes. You'll get some data back if the model's running, but if you get a question mark back, that means the model's not running. So I thought that would be kind of a clever way to see whether or not you could use that as a test to see if your model's running. So you'll notice here that we're running a script step. This is one of the script steps that was introduced in FileMaker 19 and later. It's called the configure machine learning model script step. And one of the operations here you see is called unload, and that will unload the model. And so in that case, when we unload the model, I'm also going to set this field to 0. It's already set to 0, so you're going to see here in a second, it's going to skip down to the next one, which is asking, which we have determined already that the model is not loaded, so we want to load it. And you'll see that we use the same script step. If we look at the script step, you'll see that we have to feed it the file That's this container field here. But also we have to determine whether we're going to unload the model. And if we're going to load a model, we either have to tell it whether it's a vision model, which is where we're looking at images. That's not what we're doing here. You may have seen previous movies from me where I've done vision models. But in this case, we're doing a general model, which is based on text. We feed it the model name. That's why I decided to have a model name field instead of hard coding it into the script steps. And for the same reason, I'm pointing it to the field. So in this case, it's going to load the model. And I would like to track the model state. So anytime I unload the model, I'm going to set this value to 0. Every time I load it, I'm going to set it to 1. And that helps me do different things throughout the user interface experience for the users. Like, for example, present the appropriate button to determine whether or not a model's loaded. So, okay, so our model's loaded, it's stored, and it's loaded. So let's take a look at what we can do with it. So if I go over to this layout, I have this field called input, which has data in it. You'll notice over here, I've got output calc. I'll get to that in a second. But you'll see as we go from record to record, it's analyzing these values and determining whether or not the value is positive or negative. That is our machine learning model doing its magic. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this as a calculation is because there's another consideration for you to think about. First of all, the way that we're getting this value out of here is using what's called the compute model calculation function. And I'll show you a little bit about the compute model calculation function. You'll see here that compute model is going to return back a JSON object that contains the result of the CoreML model evaluation. And there's two different ways you can do it. There's a format for general models, which is what we're doing right now, or for vision models, which I've done in previous videos. So you can see here that there's different parameters. And some of them are only relevant to vision models, most of them really. So we're just going to concentrate on the model name and the parameter. And the input parameter, in my case, instead of being like image, like you see in that example, mine is text. So we need to have the name of the model and the parameter name, and then we're going to feed it the actual value that we wanted to interpret. And that's going to be the field, the input field. You can check out some of the other examples that you see here. Most of the examples in the FileMaker documentation address vision models, but in our case, we're doing a general one. So this is actually what my calculation field looks like for this specific calculation. It's compute model. Go to the model table, which only has one record in it, so I didn't have to be any more sophisticated than that. Grab that model name, which is the sentiment model, feed it the parameter of text, and feed it the value of this field on this record, and then it results back with some data. Let's take a look, though, at how that specific calculation is set up. So here's sentiment calc. We'll take a look at that in the calculation window. First of all, this is the compute model function working right here. It's the same thing that I just showed you in the previous layout. I'm feeding it the name, parameter, and the value inside the text. But what we get back from FileMaker is JSON. So what I want to do is actually get just the piece of data from the JSON that's returned back. And that's where I'm using the JSON get element function, specifically looking for one of the elements called label. And since I'm telling it what the name in the name value pair is that I want, I am going to get returned back the value represented by label. I also took a second to also make sure that the model's loaded, because if the model isn't loaded, I'm just going to show nothing instead of the error that gets returned here. So it's just a little bit better visual for the user. So you'll see that this works rather nicely. So why would we want to have any alternative approach? Well, there's a really big consideration to answer that question, and that is because in order for compute model function to work, it needs the script step, the configure machine learning model to work. And in order for that to work, we need CoreML to be running in the background in our operating system. And that is something that's specific only to Mac OS. That's Mac OS desktop, like you see here, or even on iOS, which I think is kind of exciting that you can run and access these models on iPads or iPhones. Now, this does not mean that all users of the system need to have a Mac in order to be able to benefit from CoreML. So that's why I would like to introduce an alternative approach. So really only the user of the system needs to be able to have a Mac in order to run a model and evaluate data and give you back results of your model. So that's in those cases, I would say, like, let's say, for example, you are the administrator of your database. You happen to have a Mac OS machine, and you can come in and you can run a model and analyze some data and store the results of that data as text fields so that other users of the system can benefit from the work that you've done. So let me show you that in action. So first of all, here's a list of a bunch of different fields. And actually, you can see that these are not, it's all dynamic like any other calculation would be. So you see here, you can just identify word. But its real power comes from analyzing, more verbose text like you see here in some of these reviews. So this is what the calculation approach would look like. If the model is not loaded, then I choose to not even show anything related to the output of the model. And you can see that it shows up here and populates the fields if it's calculated. Well, what's the alternative approach to this? Well, if we go into the demonstration script layout, I've got the same records. And when I load the model, I'm going to see that there's going to be another field in here. You see where I've got my cursor in there. And instead of having a calculation determine that, I'm going to open up the script debugger so you can see the script that I've created. And what this script is doing is it's running a loop against all the records in the found set. It's then using the compute model calculation function to populate the field accordingly. And then after it's done, this is just stored data. So really this, if I'm the administrator of the database and I'm on a Mac, I can run all this information, update all those fields accordingly, and the entire found set will be populated with the results of the model. So you see here that essentially what I'm doing is I'm checking to see if the model's loaded. If it's not, I go and load it, which is something you're going to have to do in your own solutions. But then I start this loop, and really the loop is going to go through each one of the records. First of all, determine whether or not it's empty or not, because if it's empty, then we're going to get an error back. So I'm choosing to just skip it. You could do something more sophisticated if you'd like. But if it is not empty, it's going to run the prediction. And that's where if you look at the set field script step here, it's using that same calculation that I just showed you before. It's doing the compute model. It's then embedding that inside of a JSON get element, looking for the label value, and it's placing that inside the field, goes to the next record, so on and so on and so on. So once your model is done evaluating, this is just stored text. So your users can access the results of your machine learning model, whether the model is currently loaded or whether or not it can even be loaded if you're on a non-Mac OS environment. So I think this is extremely exciting as long as you can really truly understand what you're doing as far as the limitations on Mac OS are concerned. So you really just need to understand the compute model calculation function, the configure machine learning model script step, and even the get model attributes function if you want to extract certain things from a model that's running. So I hope this has been inspirational to you. I hope that you enjoy creating your own models, and look for future videos where I show you how to create an add-on with this model and to integrate those add-ons into your own solution. So thank you for watching. This is Chris Hippolyte from iSolutions from the iSolutions Lab. Thank you.